Hi. Okay. Um, so, Masaki.
Yep.
I thought your result on the, I'm gonna get it right. Was it the norovirus aptasensor or something else? Anyway, you showed a sensor result where you actually showed detection in environmental samples, and that made me so happy because oftentimes you see development of sensors and they work really well in deionized water, but you don't know how suitable they are for application in the environment. And so I was wondering, when you did those analyses, the slide was pretty brief, but it looked like you had as good of a model fit as your highly controlled system, which is a little bit surprising. I was wondering what, if any, challenges you encountered when you were using environmental samples, and if you are optimistic that kind of more challenging samples, it might work as well.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Janelle. So we evaluated the applicability of our sensor technologies to real environmental samples. Especially, we did intensive evaluation for colorimetric sensor. What we found was that the existence of ions, cations, especially cations in water samples inhibit the reaction of aptamers. So that inhibits our detection. But what we found was that the addition of EDTA to reduce the effect of cation helps us to increase the sensitivity and reduce false negatives in the environmental samples. That's what we found. And for other types of so we did that evaluation especially for groundwater samples, because groundwater samples tend to contain high amount of cations. But we are going to evaluate some false positive or false negatives derived from some environmental substances, including other environmental samples such as sewage, surface water, and so on.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you for your question.
Yes, so along the lines of biological interference, so sewage would have lots of different types of or closely related things to norovirus. So is that one of the next steps to look at the specificity aspects?
That's right. So the specificity of aptamer is governed or is affected by the design of the aptamer. So we haven't really developed aptamer that is truly specific to human norovirus. That is our future task. What we used was a model virus, mouse norovirus that does not infect humans at the moment because, as I mentioned in my presentation, we are still at the phase of proof of concept of this technology. So our future efforts will include the development of specific aptamer targeting norovirus, human norovirus particles. Thank you very much.
Well, while we're playing questions from the panel to other panelists, I was going to ask Stefan. I was very fascinated by your presentation on fate and transport of the pathogens between the bulk water and the flume in the biofilm. I wasn't very clear about the substrate where this biofilm was forming on the flume, and obviously, having seen a study like this, it seems like this is a prototype study. I was wondering if you can relate this to the problem we've got in our water pipes, and what sort of differences and things we ought to be looking out for.
Yeah, thanks. The decision was made to not introduce an additional phase, which would have been sediment. Previous work, also by Sanjay Swarup, who originally designed these flumes, involved a sediment phase, and so we decided not to do that. So to have the biofilm grow on the plastic surface. So any effect related to surface, type of surface, that wasn't part of the question, and I think you would have had a biofilm regardless of what surface you use. Absence of sediments, I think, is something we should remember. And by the way, most studies that look at flumes do not include sediment.
You want to ask the second question about how it relates to pipe flows?
Sorry. So I think obviously the flow conditions here are, we had two types of flows, not very high flow, both clearly in the laminar range And I think there is a commonality between drinking water systems and these systems, which is what is the effect of rapidly changing flow. And so we see that in drinking water because you have stagnant regions, and then you have, or stagnant times, and then you have flow taking off. And we didn't have the time to investigate what happens when you have an event such as one of our typical tropical rainstorms like yesterday. And I think that will obviously have a big effect on these biofilms. So I would expect runoff on the one hand, lots of runoff, of course, and second, lots of detachment. So there will be transport to other sites as well. I think that's probably as far as we can go. The organisms present in drinking water pipes are very different from what we see here.
A question having to do with water quality in reservoirs. Obviously, pathogens depend on rainfall and runoff, both of which are quite variable in an environment like Singapore. How rapidly do measurements have to be taken and analyzed, and agencies be able to inform the public about the suitability of contact, given this variability? That might be a Janelle question, I'm not sure.
Stefan, I think you should answer the question about the kinetics. I will say from our surveys of the diversity of microorganisms in the catchment compared to the reservoirs, we see very different microbial communities, and that suggests to us that the reservoirs are reasonably efficient at removing pathogens. Like, they're not part of the reservoir ecology. You don't see pathogens growing in the reservoir. Those reservoirs are dominated by a distinct microbiota that is adapted to that freshwater environment. So there may be trace levels of the pathogens, but they don't really show up in our data sets.
I think there is a lazy answer to your question, but it's not to discredit the question, which of course is very relevant. The lazy answer is, no matter where you are in which country, for the next 48 hours after rainfall, don't recreate, because that's when you have the exposure. That's been shown over and over again at bathing sites, and it's a common sense answer. I am more concerned about the long-term effects of these rainfalls, because I think of these biofilms as an additional reservoir. It's a sanctuary for any organisms that enter the biofilm and obviously coexist. So the fact that even viruses that have no host to replicate can just sit there and wait for their time to be detached. Human viruses will behave the very same way. And so it may even be that we cannot gauge the true extent of risk of these rainfalls by just looking at what's in the water at different times. We have to consider what's in the biofilm. So that's a potential risk. But to formulate a policy, what to do beyond my common sense answer, I think is difficult at this stage, because we are still at the discovery stage. The next phase would be to actually study biofilms in sediments in the waterways and see which organisms are there. I can ask a question. I can ask Andrew. So I was fascinated by the fact that you have essentially found a way to do research using the NUS and NTU water distribution networks. How easy do you think is it to ask questions that relate to the effect of biofilms versus organisms, communities that are passing through? So if you like, that come off the filter and then enter the distribution system and just wash out or come through, and that's what you see at the tap. Because some people think that's all that matters. And other people think biofilms matter because that's where you can enrich pathogens and then you get detachment events which are unpredictable.
Right. Well, I mean, our network isn't going to answer the question. I mean, it's going to address the second one, right? It's going to talk about the importance of biofilms within the main pipe network. But this connection business at the tap is a whole different story. And there's another level too in Singapore, of course, because people store water in roof tanks. So there's a water storage element that we're not looking at. So we're really only looking at one phase of the process, I would say. But it is an interesting one because more and more people eliminate things from the tap outwards, and the one that they know nothing about currently is the pipe network. So it's kind of the missing link in the chain. So that's why I think it's important.
Well, I have a question. So all of this is distressing. I mean, I've told people for years Singapore is the one place in Southeast Asia where you can drink the water out of the tap, and visitors come from Hong Kong and they're shocked you're drinking water out of the tap. Where's the bottled water? Say, oh, water out of the tap is great. So what's the, I mean, in recognizing at the discovery stage and so on that Stefan's talking about, what are long-term options? Is it detection at the tap of things that have come off? So Andrew's talking some about sensing that where one may say, okay, there's been some event that's loosened this stuff, but what about controlling a biofilm in pipes? Do we need some magic coating on stainless steel that will retard the formation of biofilms? Where could we be 20 years from now that may remove some of the risks that have been identified?
This sounds like a question for me. Well, first of all, drink the water. There's no problem. Hello? Press something? There's no problem with the water here in Singapore that we know of. In fact, the standards of the drinking water here in Singapore are much higher than almost anywhere. In our studies, Masaki and I looked at a comparison of quality of drinking water with respect to pathogens and things compared to the US and Europe, and the quality is very, very good. The risks are high intrinsically in Singapore, primarily because of the tropical environment and the temperature of the water in the pipes. So there are intrinsic risks here in Singapore. In terms of, we haven't really evaluated the risk. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make. We don't really understand our pipe networks very well to understand where the risks are located. And that's really what we're engaged on with this biofilm growth rate. We still think this is sort of essentially the parameter that people need to understand in order to appreciate if you want to pick up Stefan's line of argument, the reservoir of potential bad actors that can come in. So if you can control biofilm growth rate, you're doing very well. Practical infrastructure issues relating to what you do. If you've got a serious problem in your water pipes and you cannot flush it out, it is a real nuisance. And every utility knows that. And it becomes a huge problem for them. I don't know if you follow in the news, these things are small news frequently, so pervasive news. New Orleans had a terrible problem with its water supply. A child died from, what was it? What's the amoeba called? Naegleria. And they spent 3 months flushing their water supply in this area. So it becomes enormously difficult to remove when you get things in there. So I think, other than ripping up pipes and things, it's very, very difficult. And obviously, antimicrobial coatings on pipes would be a wonderful thing. In fact, we talked very extensively to Karen Gleason, you'll recall, about work on just that process, that if you could coat water pipes with antimicrobial coatings, that would be a huge advantage. But it's just not a practical reality. It's going to happen anytime soon. But the potential certainly exists. So.
Can I give a short comment? One of the things we haven't really looked at is the nutrient levels in drinking water in Singapore. In theory, if there is no nutrient in drinking water pipes, there won't be biofilm growth because bacteria cannot grow without their food nutrient. For example, in the Netherlands, they are monitoring the nutrient levels or carbon contents in drinking water pipes to suppress or to minimize the growth of biofilms in the pipes. In Singapore, we have high temperature in the tropics, and this is favorable condition for pathogens and other microorganisms to grow in the pipes. So this is something we have to investigate and consider in the future to minimize biofilm growth in tropical environments in water pipes.
Thank you. Well, I didn't mean to have the last question, but we're, I think, at a point where we should stop. The speakers, you can nab them during coffee break, and I think our slightly, modestly late start to get a quorum will mean that we start our coffee break 20 minutes after schedule. We'll finish 20 minutes after schedule, so at 11:15, please be back here, and we'll start the second session. Let's thank the speakers again.